Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Inside Iran Context for Today's Global Tensions. My name is Suzanne Parks. I'm your program manager at the World Affairs Council of Orange County. Today, I am joined by two amazing professionals in their field, Professor Nooshan Shekarabi, who will be providing us with some historical context, and Mr. Giorgio Cafiero, who will moderate a discussion after her presentation. Following the moderated discussion, we'll go into an audience Q&A, which I will moderate. So please drop your questions in the chat and we will get through, or we will try to get through everybody's questions. We're going to try to keep it in under an hour and a half, but we do have a lot to get through. So let's get into it. First, I'd like to introduce our panelist. Professor Shekarabi is a professor and chair of political science at Santiago Canyon College. Born in Tehran and raised in the US after immigrating during the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution, she brings both scholarly expertise and personal insight to discussions of Iranian politics, US-Iran relations, and Middle Eastern affairs. And we have Mr. Giorgio Cafiero, who is the CEO of Gulf State Analytics, a Washington, D.C. based geopolitical risk consultancy. He serves as an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University as well. A recognized expert in Gulf affairs, he frequently contributes to leading think tanks and media outlets and advises public and private sector organizations on geopolitical and security issues. All right. Now let's get into it. I'm going to pass this off to Professor Shekarabi, who will provide a presentation on the historical context of Iran, and then we'll again go into a moderated discussion. So off to you, Professor.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Giorgio. My gratitude to everyone who is joining in today. This is an important discussion. I expect some lively discourse, and I'm always just happy to be in this type of environment where we can have really more bring back sort of the civility to discussions and the humanity to discussing rather controversial issues. I am going to, if it's okay, share my screen because I do have a slide deck here that we're going to go through. So being an educator, the best way I know how to present is with visuals. So I'm hoping that this will be something that will be beneficial for everyone to have a visual as well. Sorry, just back to this one. Okay. All right. So the title of today's presentation is the Iran Wars, and we're using the plural here because in my perspective, we're not just talking about a specific conflict. It's really looking at a sequence of events with the obviously armed confrontations and proxy wars and direct military campaigns. And it's, I think, valuable to have some historical context, really from the time of the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran to have a greater understanding of what is happening today, and then really projecting and looking forward as to what the future is going to hold, not just for Iran, but the countries in the region, and of course the influence of Israel and the United States. So really, we're tracing it through sort of 7 decades. What we are kind of, what I'm framing from the beginning here, if you will, indulge me in this, is that essentially the wars of 2025 and 2026, they didn't sort of emerge from a vacuum. They are, in my opinion, the culmination of, frankly, 70 years of all kinds of unresolved tension, definitely failed diplomacy, and some strategic miscalculations that have taken place. So I wanted sort of that sentence of the wars of Iran, the recent Iran wars, to be at kind of the our baseline through this discussion. So I will talk a little bit about the history, the geopolitics, a little bit of the nuclear physics pertaining to the nuclear weapon program, of course, the proxy warfare, and then the operational military analysis. I really want all of you in the audience, whether you're policy professionals, folks in business, educators, students, humanitarians, diplomats, or just an engaged citizen, to really hopefully have a rich understanding of sort of what led us here. And then I'd be very interested to hear what your questions are and what your take is, and especially once Giorgio takes over, to get his take on this and see where it leads us. So I wanted to also just give you presentation roadmap for the 30 minutes that I'm with you. I will try to keep it within that timeline. Professors are notorious for going over time, but I will be very careful not to do that. So we're going to start with the historical foundations, move to the Iran-Iraq War, and the IRGC doctrine, the establishment of that. Certainly the nuclear program, Iran's nuclear program is important, looking at JCPOA and diplomacy, axis of resistance. I couldn't have this discussion without bringing in October 7th and the escalation that sort of took place, escalation cascade after that event. Certainly the 12-day war of last year, Operation Epic Fury, which I really should change the dates there. It's February through June of 2026, if this latest memo of understanding is actually sustainable. Certainly talk about the Strait of Hormuz and the global fallout, and then moving more into the strategic assessments and open questions, certainly. I also have, because I know I have a number of my students in the audience, the references available for further reading. So that is not just to entice my students to read more, but those that really are curious and would like to have these conversations outside of this webinar. I hope that I can be of service to you in that way and get you to look up some of those sources and read further. And those are this research that I use for my bibliography, putting together this presentation. Okay, so if you will indulge me, we'll go ahead and move on to the first. Oh, sorry. Apologize. Okay. So I really began this presentation in 1953 with the CIA MI6 Operation Ajax to overthrow the democratically elected Prime Minister Mossadegh. The Reza Shah Pahlavi was restored, and as many of you know, the Anglo-Iranian oil company nationalization that was done under Mossadegh was reversed. So I use a reference here, scholar Gazirovsky, and also I was referencing the other day with one of my colleagues some references to Karim Sajjadpour about talking about the permanent institutionalization of the anti-American sentiment. This anti-American sentiment has become the centerpiece of the Iranian political culture. I think that sort of distrust in Western powers and intervention was established back then. Again, moving on to 1963 with the White Revolution, again, because there's a US-backed modernization program or campaign, this again, not only I think confirmed the anti-American sentiment, but it really had a profound impact on the clerical community in Iran. And certainly, I don't need to tell you guys much about Ayatollah Khomeini being in exile and his influence there. But even if you look at what was happening in the domestic salience of the United States, there was kind of a small, if you wish, but impactful clerical uprising, kind of rejecting parts of modernization that they felt was really not what they called Eastern modernization, but really Western modernization. So there's been some resistance from that place. I think, a lot of historians, when they get to this part, they want to talk about go back to the influence of Islam on Iranian society and how that changed the way that we looked at religion in Iran and faith and its place in government. I didn't quite want to go back to the Arab influence and all of that and bringing the introduction of Islam into our society. But I think that it would be very important to know the reaction of the clerical society and how much that internally was putting pressure on what the outcome of elections were going to be or what government was going to look like from rather early on. Again, as I go through this part, I want the question that kind of stays with all of us is that, how did all of these events and these foundations play a role in what we are dealing with right now? So we want to kind of keep that in the back of our minds here. I do have a reference to 1971, the twin pillars, essentially US and Iran and Gulf strategy. I talked to my students quite a bit about Iran and Saudi Arabia being sort of regional guarantors, if you wish, and in the forefront of arms sales and the influence of the Savak and the secret police, essentially, of Iran and the strengthening of that institution by the CIA. My understanding here is that, again, in my opinion, certainly this can be argued by other folks here, the distrust of the West and the element of Iran sort of being used and abused for its oil, for its natural resources, for its geopolitics, essentially, is a common thread in Iranian political history. So at every juncture, we have a little bit of that kind of tied into it. I think, again, it would be important for us to note that these what's happening right now is not happening in a vacuum. This isn't something that just came out of nowhere. So I think that that would be important. 1978 to 1979, looking at the uprising in Iran. I was quite young at the time that this was happening, but I recall protesters on the street. I recall and overheard my parents speaking about what's happening, what's going on. Are we going to go to a protest? Are the schools going to be open tomorrow? Or is it safe for us to go to war? And I remember even in school, the sort of mobilization and the attention being brought to Khomeini, who was in exile in France at the time, and his messages that would be essentially over PA system in schools and in streets of Tehran, where I lived, and talking about, again, bringing Iran back to what it was supposed to be, sort of this notion of the good old days, and this very anti-Shah, anti-monarchy, anti-Western sort of attitude. And as being a very young girl at the time who didn't have the sophistication to understand what was happening, I did know that these uprisings were being met with a lot of uncertainty. Khomeini returned from exile February 1st of 1979, and then by April 1st, the Islamic Republic had been proclaimed. And so I think at the time, and I go back to what my parents and their friends and their generation say, they thought that this was going to be sort of a temporary shift and that this was essentially not what they were mostly looking for. There were a lot of people that were looking for secular democracy. But once the Iranian Islamic Republic was established, most folks in my parents' generation said that they couldn't imagine that it would last as long as it has, and how much it has penetrated the geopolitics of the Middle East. But I specifically remember what television was covering at the time, and how this was being sort of marketed as the new Iran and under this Islamic Republic. The hostage crisis that we often discuss, and we go back to sometimes November of 1979, where Iranian students seized the US Embassy. As you know, 52 Americans were held for 440 days. And again, that rupture, as we reference here, that pivotal moment in kind of the breakdown of the US-Iran relations, I think can really be defined by the 79 hostage taking. I am not saying that that is the only event, but I think that that would be the climactic event where the lack of trust and sort of this element of this otherness was created between Iranians and Americans, politically speaking. My parents had a number of American and non-Iranian neighbors of the time that when this was happening, they left Iran very quickly. They were obviously told to leave. Some of them were diplomats and in Iran for essentially work, and they left very, very abruptly because of what was happening, and it essentially wasn't safe for them to be there anymore. That brings us to November of 1979. Okay. I also wanted to dedicate some time looking at the Iraq-Iran war and the birth of the IRGC doctrine, the Islamic Republic Guardian Council. The war between Iran and Iraq was 8 years, 1980 to 1988. I personally, my family and I, we left in 1984, kind of smack dab in the middle of this particular crisis. And the invasion here in September of 1980 really was, some Iranian scholars have said that this was very surprising and that they never thought that Iraq would, quote unquote, dare, engage in this kind of attack. But the idea here was that the resistance of sort of the Iranian political leaders at the time of almost not taking this very seriously at the very, very beginning of this war, I think was damaging to how the war was handled. between 500,000 to a million people lives were lost during those 8 years. And frankly, there really was no winner here. This oftentimes we've talked about this as the unjust war of sort of nothingness, and that nothing strategically was accomplished that either side had hoped for. But what happened here is that the war did at least temporarily unite some folks that may have been on different sides of the political spectrum in Iran, unified them against, excuse me, a common enemy, which I do a parallel of that to June of 2025 with the 12-day war. It was interesting to see educators and other folks that I talked to here, and a lot of connections that I have in Iran, being from very different parts of the political spectrum, but sort of banding together against this invasion, which oftentimes happens. So I think we want to be quite aware of the fact that when an outsider invades, obviously, temporarily at least, the political differences and the differentiation in the narrative of where they want the political process to go may be set aside, and people sort of come together and are feeling more nationalistic, I should say. The use of chemical weapons during that time, I wanted to also highlight that was deployed against Iranians and specifically the Kurdish civilians. And even though the UN Council Resolution 598, 1987 officially sort of ended the hostilities, the residuals of that war, whether it was damage to property, obviously loss of historical sites, the many, many civilian lives that were lost, the many Iranians who returned from war with severe injuries, traumatic brain injury or PTSD, and sort of what that meant for the recovery of the Iranian economy, that lingered well into the 1990s. But Iran certainly had also from the Iraqi perspective, allowed the war to go on a little bit longer because they had refused ceasefire attempts a number of times, but eventually, obviously, the war ended. For Khomeini at the time, to resist any ceasefire, to refuse to even recognize the severity of the loss of life during this war was really a way for him to establish kind of the resilience and the strength of the Islamic Republic. I see some parallel to that with the war happening now, in how the Iranian leaders are handling it, sort of what we call in Farsi adi sazi. They want to sort of normalize everything. They want to say things are not as bad as they were. They want to say that they are winners. This narrative traces back to Khomeini. I see a lot of parallels there between the way that that war was looked at and the way that this particular war is being sort of propagandized, if you wish. It's not that bad. We're winning. We're good. Things are not as bad as the West says that it is. And that really mobilizes some people that continue to support the IRGC sort of mentality or philosophy. The IRGC was created in 1979. It's a parallel military force to defend the revolution from internal and external threats. They are not only quite organized and well established in terms of how they respond to external threats, but also to internal threats, everything from the morality police that have enforced the hijab, the modest Islamic dressing for women, to making sure that people didn't have satellite dishes, and so they weren't watching Western shows, to requiring people who are married to carry their marriage licenses. So if you're out and about and you're two people of the opposite sex, you have to prove that you have some sort of legal connection to each other. Otherwise, why should men and women who are not married be, seen together? All kinds of that kind of internal pressure for this moral code of conduct, if you wish. And of course, externally, in terms of external threats, how they deal with any type of invasion in their sense. The Quds force was established as the Foreign Operations Branch, and a lot of the funding and the training directly goes into the proxy wars of Iran. So we could certainly here talk about the influence that it has in Lebanon and Syria and the other forces in the region. The IRGC controls between 30 to 40% of the Iranian economy through Bonyad, as they call kind of foundational networks. So that could be everything from telecommunications, obviously, to media, to all kinds of resources, infrastructure, electricity, gas, water, you name it. There's a tremendous amount of control. I think of the IRGC as kind of like an octopus with its links everywhere, and a lot of salience and a lot of control and a lot of money and a lot of funding there. You guys may know that the IRGC was actually designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the United Nations in April of 2019. I wanted to double check that date there. I also have a section here that I talk about kind of the strategic doctrine, legal doctrine of the IRGC. And I wanted to make sure that we are aware of sort of their mentality or their doctrine, if you wish. Their form of containment is called forward defense. So they are to deter and engage adversaries beyond Iranian borders via proxies. So that's where the influence comes when we talk about what happens in Lebanon, or what happens in Syria, what happens in Jordan. The idea is to fight these wars anywhere but not on Iranian soil. So this forward defense doctrine has very much been part of the IRGC strategic legacy, if you wish. And then, of course, looking at deterrence, replacing conventional military parity with Israel and the United States, that is a common thread in their doctrine. And then certainly we can't go without talking about the nuclear program, framed internally as an existential guarantee. The IRGC oftentimes references Saddam's fate and Gaddafi's fate, and that the nuclear weapon program is their only sort of guarantee against an existential threat of being destroyed by the United States and Israel. I don't want to jump ahead now, but it just popped into my mind that when we talk about what did these wars of 2025 and 2026 accomplish, are they going to guarantee that Iran is not going to have a nuclear weapon? I would argue that, if anything, it confirmed their fear that unless they have a nuclear weapon, they're going to be invaded by the West. Not everyone agrees with that opinion of mine, but I think that this, again, some of the roots of this goes back to the establishment of the IRGC and in the 1980s and 1990s, what their perception was of external influence and invasion. By the US Treasury estimates, of course, these are different numbers than what the IRGC will give you. Approximately $700 million to $1 billion annually is spent just on their proxy support. So this is very much not only a structural commitment and a strategic commitment to fight these external forces, but it's also an economic commitment that they've had to it, which certainly impacts the Iranian internal economy. Nuclear program, Iran's nuclear program. I have a timeline there for you in terms of sort of when this began and when Iran signed the NPT, and how that has impacted sanctions and enrichment and sort of post-withdrawal, and really working it up to where we are now. But I don't want this presentation to necessarily come across as if without the Iran's nuclear weapon program is really the only entity that has, or the only threat that has incited wars against it. But because the nuclear program is so connected to the West, and the entanglement of where the United States comes in, it's difficult to, set it aside and say, well, is that really something we need to worry about? Were the Iranians really close to having a nuclear weapon? Well, this was really mostly, at least we know for last year, the impetus used for the 12-day war in June of 2025. And so I think that the crisis essentially is that when the influence of Israel is underplayed, and that, well, if there are presentations made by the leadership in Israel about how close the Iranians are to developing a nuclear weapon, and then you mesh that up and you put that up against the canvas of the constant political slogans and campaigns inside Iran that say things like death to Israel, or we've had former Iranian leaders say that they have to wipe Israel off the face of the map. When you talk to sort of Israeli scholars or folks that are looking at it from that perspective, they do see Iran as an immediate existential threat to the establishment of Israel. And because of the US's support of Israel, all of these things go hand to hand. Oftentimes, I have my students responding to that of, well, that's it. It's as simple as that. It is and it isn't. How involved Iran was going to be in terms of the credibility that it was going to give to the Americans on the non-proliferation front is a whole different monster that we need to deal with. This crisis of the nuclear program really became permanent in August of 2002. The National Council of Resistance of Iran publicly disclosed the existence of undeclared enrichment facilities of Natanz and other areas, and also Iraq, the city of Iraq. So the IAEA inspectors that followed, or inspections that followed, excuse me, confirmed that Iran had been operating a covert enrichment program. And that had been going on for between 17 to 18 years, if I have my notes correct here. And that was in violation of the NPT safeguards and safeguard obligations. So from that moment on, the nuclear weapon program and the potential capability of Iran's nuclear weapon building essentially really became a major concern, or kind of was centralized in the Israeli foreign policy towards Iran. And the case for this is what's going to lead to regional instability, and this is a human rights issue, and we need to really kind of deal with this through the lens of counterterrorism, that the IRGC is going to eventually harm the world, and Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. How many American presidents have we say Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon? There's no way that this should be happening. The JCPOA of 2015 essentially was supposed to extend the breakout time to approximately 12 months of the uranium enrichment, and then cap it at 3.6%, which was well below, I believe, the 20% enrichment that Iran had achieved before the negotiations began. But essentially, by really any technical standard, I would argue that this was a significant achievement of arms control, if we have 3.6% over, a 20% here. But the IAEA, even though they had what they deemed to be kind of unprecedented access to inspections, critics said that this was really these restrictions were still not going to be enough in order to make sure that Iran's nuclear capacity was not going to be, quote unquote, out of control. And so what the JCPOA was supposed to be was this compromise. Now, we do know that eventually the JCPOA was removed, or we got out of it via the Trump administration. Certainly people will argue that part of the trouble that we see with Iran now is the pulling out of the JCPOA. But when you look back to, again, the beginning of the 2025 war on June 12th, the Israelis attacked within 12 hours of the end of these unsuccessful negotiations. And so there's conversations about where was the attack, planned way before the failing of any type of negotiation. We could certainly argue that, a lot of disputes about that. But I think the response I would argue that the June 12th response in 2025 by Israel was really not spontaneous. I think that there had certainly been more planning on the part of Israel as to when they were going to attack Iran. And that essentially, we have to understand when we pull out of a treaty, when we are doing a different form of, when we are abandoning diplomacy, essentially, what price do we pay? And the collapse and consequences of the withdrawal from the JCPOA are important for us to pay attention to. So for anyone who might be a little bit less familiar with the JCPOA of 2015 to 2025, I set out here some key provisions here from the initial draft of this. Just try to simplify this as much as possible in interest of time and to be mindful of everyone's time, especially Georgia's time, who's coming right after my presentation here, and of course the question and answer period. So the framework here is with the P5+1, US, United Kingdom, France, Russia, China, and Germany, mediated by the European Union High Representatives. Iran was to cap enrichment, as I said, by 3.6% centrifuge count, which was reduced from 66%, excuse me. The IAEA was supposed to, quote unquote, anytime, anywhere, have access to inspection, and that there would also be enhanced monitoring, with additional protocols. The sanction relief is important here. $100 billion in frozen assets were to be released and oil exports were to be permitted. Of course, there was some sunset clauses about the centrifuge restrictions that would expire in 10 years and the uranium limits of 15 years. So the collapse timeline is here. In May of 2018, President Trump withdraws. In 2019, Iran reduces their compliance. The enrichment went to 20%, then 60%. January of 2020, as you guys know, the United States was involved in the killing of Soleimani. And again, Iran not only obviously will use that to bring attention to how much Iran is under threat, but certainly began to further distance itself from the deal. And then between 2021 and 2023, President Biden has indirect talks which were deemed to not be successful. And when President Raisi, the former president of the United States, who was killed in of Iran, who was killed in a plane crash, was elected, one of the main themes of his campaign was that they were not going to engage in diplomacy, and that the withdrawal of the of the United States from the JCPOA was going to be one of the reasons why they were not interested in further diplomacy. I actually put together a little bit about Iran's axis of resistance, the proxy network, and the continuation of that forward defense doctrine that I mentioned to you guys earlier. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, and then the PFP or the Khattab in Iraq. The financial support, the training, the weapons, the involvement, the sponsoring, the help of attacks is one of the centerpieces of the IRGC's, I believe, resilience and commitment to maintaining their livelihood, frankly. This is their proxy strategy. They will fund, they will train, they will arm, they will politically support any of these non-state actors throughout the region. With this latest MOU that is supposed to be signed tomorrow, there's been a lot of conversations about, well, what happens if Israel, for example, continues attacks in Lebanon? Iran will certainly respond with Hezbollah, for example. Of course, that seems to be a very predictable outcome these days. I don't know if anything here that is on this graph here will necessarily any of the strategies or the doctrines that are set here will necessarily be of great change in the times to come, even with the signing of this MOU, because I operate from a place of caution. One of my students just asked me this morning, you must be pretty excited with the MOU. You must think that things are going to be a little bit more stable now. Are you hopeful? And I said, I'm very cautiously optimistic, because there are many, many players here, and there is much political and financial investment in how these proxy networks are being run, and what the response of the United States and Israel would be should Iran continue to fund these proxy wars. So I will remain very, very cautiously optimistic as to what this MOU will mean and what the restrictions of it will play out. So you can see here from just the amount of money and essentially human resource, human commitment to this, and the attacks that have taken place and the blockades, even if you talk about the Red Sea blockade, for example, or the attacks of October 7th, this complicates this already very complicated, excuse me, I went back on that one, already very complicated dynamic between the West and Iran. So I have those highlighted there for you in terms of how this has played out and the influence that Iran has in all of these places to continue to fight what they deem to be external forces, of course. All right. Okay. I couldn't have a presentation for you guys today without talking about October 7th. So October 7th of 2023, Hamas launches a very large assault on Israel, largest since 1948. 1,200 people were killed, 250 people were taken hostage. The IRGC has supported this attack, but has denied direct involvement, direct planning, specifically to use their terminology here. I often say, the perception, though, is that their support. The perception is that this might as well be an attack from Iran, the way that the West has essentially seen this. Hezbollah opened up the northern front here. The Houthis declared war on Israel. We have the PMF attacks in Iraq and on the U.S. bases. And so this area is now fully activated, fully participating in the aftermath or what we call the escalation cascade of October 7th attacks. Of course, again, if you go on, we continue with the attacks and with the launching of the strikes between January of 2024 all the way through June of 2025, which leads us right up to the 12-day war. So what I was saying at the very beginning is that, again, these slides and these events that I'm talking about, whether it's the historical foundations or what has happened with the nuclear weapon program or the tensions between Iran and Israel or the proxy wars, et cetera, none of those things are just random things that happen. They all, in my opinion, lead to one event after another. The revolution sets up the IRGC, the war ends, and then we move on to other proxy wars, and then we look at sort of the modern wars of now. So I do believe that these are all sort of tied together. You can't really discuss them as random events. That's why I wanted us to be mindful of that. I want to also be mindful of your time here and to not go over. Let's go ahead and talk about the 12-day war, June 13th to the 24th. On June 13th, Israeli launches Operation Rising Lion. The United States actually wasn't officially involved until June 21st. They enter with Operation they call Midnight Hammer. The duration was 12 days, but the focus was the 3 nuclear sites, Fordo, Natanz, and the Isfahan sites, those 3 in particular. The IAEA declared Iran non-compliant on July 12th, 2025, as I mentioned a few slides back when those negotiations failed. And this triggered Israel's strike decision within 12 hours. They targeted nuclear facilities, missile factories, military command structures, again in Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan, and also some senior IRGC commanders, specifically in Tehran, but also in Natanz, in Isfahan, and in Tabriz as well. And Iran's air defense network was dismantled within 48 hours or so. June 21st is the direct official day with the Operation Midnight Hammer, and they deployed B-2 Spirit bombers and naval cruise missiles against Fordo. The Fordo site, they believe it was 280 feet underground, where the nuclear facilities and the dynamic of that area of that facility was. President Trump declared that the sites were completely destroyed and the nuclear weapon capabilities of the Iran was no longer there. And the official conclusion came on June 24th, kind of mission accomplished, and Iran suspended all its IAEA cooperation. Inspectors were to leave by July 4th. And Iran announced new enrichment sites and advanced centrifuge programs. This came up this year, when the war began again, one of the things that the Trump administration was asked about is that, well, if the major nuclear facilities were destroyed, what are we worried about? Why are we going there? There was a lot of questioning at the beginning of this war that we're in now. Why are we going there? If we have obliterated anything that they have, why are we going back into Iran? Is it to liberate Iranian people from their regime, especially because the war that began in February was after the January massacre, essentially, of Iranian citizens that were protesting against the regime by the regime? Are we going there for regime change? Are we going to dismantle nuclear weapon program? What are we doing? And we still continue with those questions, but we can talk a little bit about that later, about what those questions meant and what they continue to mean now. And we have different answers now. But I believe that, again, that the 12-day war was really kind of a precursor, if you wish, a pre-shock to the earthquake of this year's war, because I think that there were a lot of unresolved issues and when I say issues, I'm making it seem like they were having an argument, a personal argument, but I think a lot of the goals, the strategic goals of Israel, Iran, and the United States were not met. And so I am not that surprised that the next war took place a year later. So here we are, Operation Epic Fury. You can tell when I put these slides together because I put the end date of May 5th, and that's certainly not the case. Epic Fury, the US-Israeli joint campaign here, was obviously an attempt to, again, dismantle Iranian nuclear weapon facilities. But this time it was different because we are looking at a much larger campaign than what they had in June of 2025. So February 28th, 2026, Epic Fury was launched. And the question that I, again, wanted to sort of answer is that the question that was remaining after the 2025 war was, what happens if Iran reconstitutes its nuclear weapon program? Can they recover after, the attack that they experienced? And the answer was, well, yes. And if they do, there's going to be a second, much more aggressive campaign here. So the underlying logic that we have been told is that degradation without resolution creates an escalation sort of process. And so even if the Iranian nuclear weapon capabilities had been weakened, they were not destroyed. Also, this time, it was hard for me personally at the beginning, and maybe this was my mistake, to think that there wasn't going to be at least a desire for some level of regime change when Khamenei was assassinated. But certainly, again, there have been so many differing kind of perspectives and outcomes and predictions with this conflict that I would be not quite honest if I said, well, this is all, the way that I expected it to be. A lot of things that happened are happening are very unprecedented. Trump really did underestimate the regime's resilience. Now, when I say, I don't mean that somehow it's obviously not in support of the Islamic Republic in any way, shape, or form. But I believe that Trump miscalculated what this attack was going to mean. I think there may have been a misconception that this would be very similar to Venezuela. We take out the leader and then we sort of take over in an interim, and then, we leave and then everything will be fine. And that's a very sort of modest, elemental way of dealing with something very serious, and that should be looked at from a much more sophisticated, scholarly manner. But if anything, I think that what had happened is that the Iranian government feels now more emboldened to sort of hang on to what they have established. And much of the harm, I would argue, all of the harm is to the Iranian civilians economically. Obviously, in terms of their safety, a lot of the bombings were beyond just bombing, and killing and assassinating Iranian leaders. This did really impact a lot of civilians and a lot of sites that were in residential areas or military sites or facilities that the Israelis and the Americans were interested in destroying, but they harmed civilians. Certainly, the first attack on the schoolgirls in Minop was the beginning of a lot of these conversations that I never thought that we would have. So So I broke this down into phases. Phase one in February of 2026, the 900 U.S. Israeli strikes in the first 12 hours, very aggressive campaign. Supreme leader was killed on the first day. A number of other senior officials were assassinated. Iranian defenses, ballistic missiles, stockpiles, and all of that were targeted. And again, the first major tragedy of this war, of course, was the 170 civilians that were killed at the school in Manab, most of them children. The second phase of kind of retaliation and escalation is March through April of 2026. So Iran retaliates rather aggressively, even though, of course, Iranian military capability is far below, obviously, what the Israelis and the Americans can do, but certainly they did retaliate. And they began the mining of the Strait of Hormuz and navigation restriction. And of course, that puts an impact on the global oil prices. And the US Navy then does their naval blockade in April of 2026. And this intensifies more and more of the fighting here and continuing with the regional strikes, of course. And then the third phase, with kind of a declared, what we thought was conclusion on May 5th, was the joint operations to obviously conclude on that day. And even though thousands were killed in Iran, Lebanon, and Israel and Gulf states, many folks were also displaced. We don't talk often about the folks that have been displaced as a result of these attacks. And we have a new IRGC kind of dominated leadership, you know, more, I would argue, more hardlined, or at least as hardline like as Khamenei. A lot of discussions about his son Mujtaba, which no one has seen in public. There were some rumors that perhaps he is not alive and that he was killed in the attacks. Others said, no, he is alive, but he is severely injured. You know, oftentimes we even had folks, senior officials in the Trump administration, talk about, well, we're talking to their leadership without actually naming folks. So that remains to be unseen. But again, this is where we are. This will push us over to the memo of understanding between these two forces, and we'll see what the aftermath of that is. And of course, that's where I want to, as I get closer to the end of my presentation here, those are some of the things that we will be discussing when we pose some questions and Giorgio comes into the discussion and we talk about sort of the effect of this conflict in the region, not just Iran, Israel, and the US, but in the region. What does it mean for the region? What does it mean for the future of the region? I think that would be important for us to talk about. Strait of Hormuz and the global consequences. I wanted us to, just in case anyone here is not familiar with this, for you to understand the importance of the impact of the Strait of Hormuz on the globe here. The energy impact alone, 21 million barrels a day transit the strait. That's approximately 21% of the global petroleum supply. So we look at the oil prices spiking. We look at essentially the impact of the U.S. blockade and the naval blockade, excuse me. This is, the golden ticket for the Iranians, right? We're going to close the Strait of Hormuz. This is how much control we have on the global economy. The geopolitical fallout cannot be ignored, certainly. The current Tehran government, IRGC-dominated government, is rather aggressive. You guys may know that the number of executions almost doubled during this time, and these are mostly the protesters of the month of January that were being systematically and oftentimes not prosecuted and just executed. The economic pressure, the hyperinflation in Iran, unemployment, displacement, damage to buildings and properties, just millions of people being displaced across the globe, not just in Iran. And what we talk a little bit here about the deterrence paradox. So the worst case scenario was that US and Israel were going to attack Iran in this manner. Let's say that's the worst case scenario. But the idea here is that if the end goal was to make sure that we have Iran that is free of a nuclear weapon, did the opposite actually happen, right? Did we now reconfirm their case for wanting to have a weapon. So I wanted to just have you guys have a very small look into the influence of the Strait of Hormuz and the economic impact of this war. Oftentimes we forget that behind these charts and these graphs and these seminars and webinars and discussions are people, are civilians, are people all across the world that are being impacted by, this impacts refugees and immigration and economic supply, currency values, trade, et cetera, et cetera. So much for us to take in here, such a heavy topic. The fear of a regime ending strike was Iran's sort of primary constraint on nuclear ambitions. Iran's leadership calculated that if it actually obtained nuclear weapons, the US and Israel would launch an existential military action. So the threat of the action was the deterrent, right? So I'd like for us to think about that a little bit and maybe discuss that when we have the question and answer period as to if you see it in that way and what different angles can we look at that very idea of deterrence. Iran has experienced the most comprehensive military campaign in its modern history, and it survived it. So if the political system is intact, if we don't actually have full regime change, if we just have a change of leadership without the regime actually changing, what does that mean? Have we fundamentally weakened Iran or not? If the regime survival is possible, even after an attack of this magnitude, then the risk calculus for pursuing nuclear weapons has shifted dramatically, I would argue. Iran may now conclude, I don't know, I don't want to do any predictions here, but the thoughts that come to my mind is Iran may now conclude that nuclear weapons are the only way, actually, the true guarantor of regime survival and not the risk factor that makes regime survival possible. That's potentially what they could be thinking about here.
Sorry to interrupt, Nushan. We'll have to run through the next slides very quickly because we are
Sure.
running out of time, but
Yes.
I'll let
Yes.
you
Thank
finish
you.
your
Thank
presentation.
you so much for doing that. I appreciate it.
Of course. Yeah.
And lastly here, some strategic assessments and unresolved questions here. Some things for us to talk about as we finish this up. That the wars achieved their objectives. What about the nuclear deterrence paradox and the proxy network being degraded but not dismantled? And some things for us to think about. Will the Strait reopen fully? Will negotiations be possible? Can a nuclear agreement be reached? Will Iran now pursue overt weaponization? And will the roles of Russia and China, what roles will Russia and China play in Iran's reconstruction? I was going to talk about that a little bit, but I'll leave it for the question and answer period because, again, thanks to Suzanne, I went over time. So sorry about that, but thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share here.
Yeah, right. This is the references. If you want to put it back up and anybody
Sure.
anybody in
Yes.
the audience, if you want to like take a screenshot or whatever,
Sure.
Nushan
Of
has been
course.
so kind as to provide some references for further reading. And again,
Yes.
this will be on YouTube as well, so you can reference that. But here's some really amazing references and recommended reading, so you can further your study on the topic. But without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Giorgio to go into the moderated discussion. And then, yeah, we'll continue. Thank you. You can unshare your screen.
Yes. Thank you.
Great. Well, Nooshan, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. That was really, really interesting, very informative. In this remaining section, I have some questions for you. Then I think we're going to jump in and take some questions from those in the audience. And I see that some have already been coming in. My first question for you has to do with something that you referenced at the way end of your presentation. I think it's important to sort of zoom out a little bit and look at the American-Israeli war on Iran in a really global context and consider how certain global powers have impacted the war and how the conflict has impacted Iran's relationship, specifically with China and Russia. So maybe if you want to share some of your assessments on how this war played out in terms of Iran's relationships with Beijing and Moscow, and maybe the perspectives that Chinese and Russian policymakers had on the conflict, and just in general how this war maybe impacted great power competition at large. I'm sure we would all be very interested in your take on these dynamics.
I think China's priority remains energy security and certainly the Gulf security, Gulf stability, excuse me. So I think Russia benefits from the U.S. distraction, I think, but I believe that Russia has to balance its ties with the Gulf states just because of how this, the kind of the global aftermath of this conflict. I think Iran may gain some diplomatic backing, but I'm not sure if its bargaining power with Beijing and Moscow is going to be much different. I think it will remain rather constrained. That would be my guesstimate at this point. I think that the conflict has strengthened Iran, maybe more symbolically, but I think in terms of how it negotiates with Russia and China, considering their interests in the region, that still would be rather constrained and cautious. That would be my take on that. Yeah.
Interesting. Another question. Obviously, it's clear that the Islamic Republic proved very resilient throughout this conflict, and probably most experts would agree that the fall of the regime is not something that we can expect anytime in the immediate upcoming period. And therefore, I'm curious, in your opinion, to what extent has this conflict strengthened Iran's position as a regional power, and how has the regime's resilience impacted the image that Iran has as a force to contend with in the Middle East?
I think, unfortunately for the Iranian people inside Iran who are being oppressed, and for essentially anyone that wants to deal with Iran externally, it has, I think that this conflict, I would argue, has actually strengthened the resilience and and has, in a way, I think, guaranteed at least the temporary survival of this regime. They are emboldened. They feel very much in control to be able to sort of use the Strait of Hormuz as a bargaining chip must be incredibly empowering for them. I think what it has done is that put them in a position where they have said, hey, listen, you tried twice and we're still here, but also if you want to bargain with us, these are the terms of the bargaining. I think that their response to everything the Trump administration said, every time the Trump administration said up, they said down. Every time they said, well, we signed a deal, we're moving on, or, we're not going to, we're going to guarantee they're not going to have nuclear weapons, or we're going to guarantee they're going to deal with things differently. Just that initial objection to it creates the image that they are in control. I'm not going to say that they are necessarily they're not untouchable, but I think that because they have realized that there may have been some miscalculations on the part of the Trump administration, and how quickly the Trump administration assumed that they could not only harm Iran's nuclear weapon program, but completely dismantle the regime, because those goals have not been met, that strengthens Iran, at least in image. And a lot of politics, as you know, is the image. So I think that, unfortunately, in my opinion, the Trump administration has legitimized the survival capabilities of the Islamic Republic. And that, to me, is worrying, because mostly of what that does internally to the Iranian civilians, and then, of course, the cost that they pay economically as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I may, I would sort of add to that. If we're going to see the issue of sanctions from the Iranian perspective, we obviously don't know after Friday, during the 60 days that follows, what specifically is going to be agreed upon in terms of sanctions relief. But clearly, assuming that this MOU ends up being signed in Switzerland on Friday and things proceed, there will be sanctions relief. And there's a certain perspective from Iran that they wanted sanctions relief through the JCPOA. They complied with the JCPOA. Trump decided to have the US unilaterally pull out of the JCPOA despite Tehran's compliance. Sanctions got reimposed. Then at different points, there were talks about sanctions being lifted. That never happened. And now, after a few months of war, that's what's resulting in sanctions being lifted. So the takeaway from Iran might be that there's not really there's a lot more to gain from being aggressive and confrontational toward your adversaries rather than negotiating and going down a diplomatic route. And I think that sets a precedent not only for Iran-US relations, but for other countries around the world who observe that and how they might approach their relationships with the US if they happen to have adversarial ties with Washington. So I think there's huge implications there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I could not agree with you more. Absolutely.
Moving on to this point about what's going to be negotiated in the upcoming 60 days beginning on Friday. Obviously, the nuclear issue is one of the delicate, sensitive issues that the two sides are going to have an opportunity to try to reach some sort of an agreement on. Now, we all know that it was Donald Trump during his first term who pulled the U.S. out of the JCPOA, as we just discussed a moment ago. Now, this is my question. We obviously do not know what the arrangement would be on the nuclear file, but assuming that the two sides do reach some sort of nuclear compromise and there is some sort of a nuclear deal that Washington and Tehran enter into, to what extent could we realistically expect this to be any different from the 2015 JCPOA?
I'm not very optimistic that it will be much different. The reason being, I don't think that either, because there's such a lack of trust by both sides, and because, as you mentioned earlier, the aggressive, assertive position that Iran has taken has helped it to gain more than lose. I don't expect it to be all that different. I think that there has to be, they have to sort of, to use a term of movies here and Godfather, like they have to make an offer to one another that the other one cannot refuse. I don't see a tremendous amount of difference unless there is greater influence, I think, from other countries, specifically maybe from Russia and China, and in terms of their desire to hang on to their regional stability and their obviously energy access. I think perhaps if those were considered, we would have a slightly different, more sustainable agreement. But at this point, at the very moment that we're here together, I don't see it being much different or necessarily even better than the JCPOA at this stage of the game. So yeah.
Well, that raises important questions about what was really gained from walking away from the JCPOA in May 2018. This was a war that cost so much money to US taxpayers, to say nothing about the loss of life. And then it ends with us signing something that is more or less the same as the JCPOA. It's very depressing to think about, but maybe in another discussion we could have that a look at that question too.
Yes.
I also wanted to talk about Iran's relationship with the Arab countries in the neighborhood. As I'm sure everyone is aware, as soon as the US and Israel began their military operations against Iran on February 28th, Tehran retaliated by attacking a whole host of countries in the neighborhood with missile and drone strikes. The Gulf, all six of the GCC members were targeted. Although Iran claims it did not attack Oman, it certainly takes responsibility for attacking the other five: Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, and Bahrain. Also attacks on Jordan, Cyprus, and of course Israel itself. And although Iran denies attacking Turkey and Azerbaijan, those two countries did come under attack as well. So really focusing in on the Gulf Arab monarchies that share the Persian Gulf with Iran. Definitely each member of the GCC has a unique relationship with Iran, but just in general, as a consequence of those missile and drone attacks that Iran carried out against the GCC states, this was officially justified, or at least the Iranians framed it as being justified, because of those countries hosting the US military at various bases in their countries, and allegations that the US carried out Operation Epic Fury from those countries' military bases and by using their airspace. It created a crisis in Iran GCC relations. Now that we maybe have some reason to be optimistic about de-escalation, how do you see Iran's relationships with the Gulf Arab countries such as UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia moving forward?
I think the Gulf states initially, I think, were trying to pursue kind of a pragmatic approach, like they were seeking to avoid being drawn into this conflict, and then maintaining some relationships with multiple regional actors, and the focus remaining, economic development and regional stability, and of course protecting their critical energy structure. I think from this point onward, it's really Iran has to step up, I think, and offer them some sort of guarantee, some sort of agreement, some sort of treaty that should there be another war, should there be more conflict to come with the United States, that they would be protective of the Gulf states. I know that might sound like a crazy idea, but I think that because Iran is acting aggressive and kind of has his chest pumped up and look at us, everybody, wants to see what we're doing next, is not realizing that if you lose any type of support from the Gulf states, UAE, Qatar, any of those, that it's going to be very hard for me to recover from that, even if they are not interested in what that would mean for them to stop attacking or impacting US bases, for example, in those countries. Even if they're going to take out the moral motivation, the economic motivation alone, I am hoping will get them to the bargaining table to be more protective of those Gulf states rather than to sort of punish them for hosting the United States militarily or being kind to the Trump administration, whatever you might call it. I think that the Gulf states initially had a much more, again, pragmatic and frankly workable solution, but it didn't remain that way because Iran essentially drew them in. So to answer your question, I think Iran has to make concessions to the Gulf states in order to be able to get them back to some sort of bargaining table, some sort of support, in my opinion.
Based on that, though, I wanted to ask, what are some concessions that you think the Gulf Arab states would be willing to make to Iran? Clearly, Iran believes that the U.S. military presence on the Arabian Peninsula is a huge threat. Do you see any possible arrangement whereby the Gulf Arab states, maybe they don't entirely eject the U.S. military, but maybe they reach some new arrangements with the U.S. that would put Iran at ease? Do you think there's any possible changes in GCC-U.S. relations that might result from this conflict?
I think it's exactly that. It's to make new arrangements, to have new treaties, to set up some sort of non-aggression treaty, some sort of commitment, some sort of essentially insurance policy that the harm will be, I'm sure the harm will not be eliminated, but less. But I think the answer to your question is in your question, that there would be have some sort of new agreements with the United States in order to ease Iran's worries, but at the same time kind of protect themselves against further harm. Because I really do feel like the Gulf states, again, were really trying to stay away from this conflict and they were drawn in. So absolutely, I think that the answer is in your question.
Well, thank you so much. I think right now we're actually going to jump into the Q&A session and get some of the questions from the audience members.
Yeah, thank you guys. I know we had a couple more questions, but being mindful of everybody's time. So I only have 3 questions in the chat. If you guys have any questions, please pop them in and we'll run through them. Tim Welch had some really great questions. I'll go through the first one because it's very interesting. He says, please help us understand why Iran feels compelled to fund proxies to foment terror in the region as their people suffer from lack of resources and assistance. What do they really think this will achieve? Because they're paying a very high price, sanctions, for instance, for whatever they're trying to achieve. And do you see any of the goals being achieved or moving that direction? So either Giorgio or Nooshan, if you want to take that.
Giorgio, do you want to take it or you want me to take it?
Sure. Well, I'm happy to at least start. I think it's important to understand the forward defense doctrine that Iran has. After the Iran-Iraq war wrapped up in 1988, the Iranian leadership was very determined to make sure that the country would not be attacked again. And it's really within this context that Iran is very motivated to give support to non-state actors in the region that many countries in the West, as well as Israel and even certain Arab states, consider to be terrorist organizations. For many years, Iran's interests in giving so much support to Hezbollah in Lebanon was based on the calculation that the group in Lebanon being so heavily armed could deter Israel from attacking Iran. Arguably, that was effective at least until 2024. Also, let's keep in mind Iran has given a lot of support to various factions in Iraq. This really started well, there's a long history of ties between Iran and different Iraqi Shia groups going back to the Ba'athist era. But after Saddam Hussein fell in 2003, if you're sitting in Iran, to the east, you have the US military occupying Afghanistan. To the west, occupying Iraq. Remember, George W. Bush talked about the axis of evil, included Iran. Back in the mid 2000s, the Iranians were very concerned that their country would be the next target in the so-called war on terror. And so giving weapons and other forms of support to armed groups in Iraq that were resisting the American and British occupation was a way of raising the costs for occupying Iraq. And from Iran's standpoint, that was a move aimed at defending Iran from the United States. And also, let's keep in mind in Iraq, the Iranians gave a lot of support to Shia factions, very heavily armed Shia factions that were fighting the Islamic State, which Iran perceived as a huge threat to Iran, bringing us back to 2014 and throughout the remainder of the 2010s. So I would say that Iran has in large part given support to these groups because they see that this as important to defending their own country. At the same time, when it comes to giving support to Palestinian groups, I think a little more cynically, this plays into Iran's desire to be a leader in the wider Islamic world, and this serves certain soft power agendas of being able to connect with Arabs and Muslims around the world by saying when many Arab governments are allied or partnered to the US, they choose not to confront Israel. But Iran is the only Islamic power in the world that actively invests in the Palestinian resistance. So there's definitely some self-interests and soft power motives that Iran has as well.
Absolutely. I would absolutely agree with that. Also, if you just look at it from, I think part of the question was also, why are they doing this while inside their own country there is such chaos and economic downfall and harm to their own civilians? I think if you look at it from a constructivist perspective, this is sort of the IRGC's element of what they deem to be honor for them as a regime. And for them to continue to be, as Giorgio said, this Islamic force in the world, we will protect, these forces that could potentially be harmed by the Western powers. So it's very much still that notion of that otherness, the othering of any entity that is not in agreement with whatever this regime is trying to accomplish. But that ties a little bit into what they deem to be their perception of honor and placement in the region. I think that's important as well. I hope that helps a little bit.
Thank you both. We'll go through the next question. Another one from Tim. He says, if Iran just became nationalistic and focused on building their country instead of creating chaos in the Middle East, doesn't it stand to reason the rest of the world would back off and allow them to become a world player, thus allowing them to build or rebuild their country? And then another question, why don't the mullahs see this and how their country is suffering and then shift to a more nationalistic approach as it would benefit their citizens?
I'll start this, and then Giorgio, please feel free to jump in anytime. I think that a logic and rationale would say to you that, well, why wouldn't the mullahs want that? Why wouldn't the regime want that? To essentially have Iran be politically independent and free from external intervention, and wouldn't that be better for them internally and externally? I think that's where the rational mind goes, and this question is a very logical, rational question. But we're not dealing necessarily with rationality. We're dealing with a regime that is essentially wanting to protect itself at any cost. We have this reference in Persian that says, Iran will, loosely translated, that these mullahs, if they ever let go of power, if they ever let go of Iran, we will have a burnt Iran. Iran will burn to the ground in every way, shape, or form, because for them, it's complete protection of themselves and their resources and their influence. So yes, that question is logical and rational. If you focus on unity and nationhood, wouldn't you be able to kind of free yourself from any type of external intervention? Yes, but that's not what the goal of the mullahs is. That they are not interested in that. Very much, in my opinion, there's even otherness within. They see themselves as the leaders, and then the Iranian people. They don't see themselves as part of the society as at large. And I know that some of my answer is influenced by me being Iranian, not supporting the regime. But if there had been any type of consideration or a desire to protect the Iranian people, they would not be murdering their own protesters. They would be more concerned about the face of the economy. They would be providing better services, social services, for example. They would help their citizens recover from natural disasters more quickly. So the rationale is, yes, protect your own people, but they don't see themselves as part of the larger population.
Thank you, Nooshan.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. We will go. Okay, this is an interesting one. How are the US midterm elections figuring into Iran's calculus as it negotiates, quote unquote, negotiates with the Trump administration? Are they acting in a way to try to weaken or thwart Trump?
Georgia, you want to take that?
Well, clearly, no U.S. president who has to consider the fact that midterm elections are coming up later on in the year would want to have gas prices be so high and to have the U.S. economy suffering from global energy crisis. And the Iranians understand that Trump really has wanted to wrap up this conflict as quickly as possible, not at any cost, not in a way that would make Trump look weak or would humiliate Trump. But I think they've understood that he's an American president who doesn't want the U.S. pulled into protracted conflicts in the Middle East. And they understand that it serves his political interests and the political interests of Republicans who are up for re-election in November if this conflict can wind down. And so Iran, I think the Iranian officials, decision makers, were able to understand the domestic political dynamics that Trump was dealing with. And I think to their credit, they were able to take advantage of those dynamics very effectively throughout this conflict. And those dynamics are obviously going to be in play in the upcoming, I guess, 64 or 63 days as these talks are going to be taking place. The Iranians, basically, they proved to be very effective in terms of internationalizing this conflict immediately by attacking GCC states that are very central to the global economy, shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. They proved to be very good at making the entire world, including the United States, pay a price for this. And that definitely has hurt Trump politically in the United States as well as Republicans. I do think because of this conflict, Republicans will suffer in November. This war has not been popular here in the United States, and there's a lot of polling to back up that point. And so this was a weak spot of Trump that Iran was able to take advantage of.
Absolutely. The Iranians have been very good at, and they are very good at understanding domestic politics of the United States. They have a very clear understanding that if you talk, especially to young people in Iran, students in high school and college, they have a very, very clear understanding of that. So they are very well aware of how any move that is made by the United States or by Iran is impactful. So multiply that exponentially by the political leaders in Iran, knowing what is at stake and sort of playing, a Trump in the way that they want to. Even those, animations that came out with the Legos and all of that, kind of a comical, but I think impactful way of mocking a sort of not just the administration, but the U.S. Political system and the influence of corporations and, the role of Israel and all of that. So when you have, in the case of the United States, your enemy is Iran, and you have an informed enemy that has an understanding of what your system's weaknesses and strengths are. I think it will use it to that and to their advantage. And I think, as Georgie said perfectly, they internationalize this conflict very effectively, I believe, and that is why I think the Iranian government sees themselves as the winners of this conflict, if there is such thing.
Great responses. Yeah. Tim Welch, again, great questions, by the way. But yeah, I love the perspective. It's giving us a little bit, more perspective, I guess. Does anyone think that Iran didn't know about the October 7th attacks, considering that they are a major funder of Hamas, and they support Hamas as the axis of resistance? Can you see how this is hard for Americans, for any Americans to really believe that they didn't have any idea about October 7th? Your response.
I'm happy to respond. There's a very simple answer to this question. Who would believe that Iran did not have any foreknowledge of the attacks? The answer is the U.S. intelligence community. March 2024, U.S. intelligence agencies concluded that Iran's government had nothing to do with the planning, the orchestrating of the October 7th attacks, and had no foreknowledge of it. That being said, for many, many years, Iran has encouraged groups to attack Israel. There's no doubt that I'm sure the Iranian leadership was very pleased to see the attacks take place, but there is absolutely no evidence that Iran had any sort of a hands-on role. On this point, I would also like to add that I do not consider Hamas to be a proxy group of Iran. They have received support from Iran's government, but there are also many instances where Hamas has done things that have completely gone against Iran's foreign policy agenda. Let's go back to late 2011, early 2012. Iran was very strongly supporting the Syrian government of President Bashar al-Assad, but Hamas cut off its relationships with Assad's regime and openly supported the opposition, supporting the Sunni Islamist groups that were fighting to overthrow Assad's government. And then also in Yemen, let's recall that Iran was giving support to the Houthi rebels who took control of Sana'a and other parts of Yemen in 2014. But come March 2015, when there was the Saudi-led military coalition that began its operations to dislodge the Houthis from the capital of Yemen, Hamas openly supported the Saudi military campaign. So on these huge regional issues, Hamas has often been in opposition to Iran's foreign policy agenda. All of this is just to say, I think many people sometimes are mistaken when they refer to Hamas as a so-called proxy of the Islamic Republic.
I think, Tim, to go back to how could anyone not believe that Iran was involved? I think there's evidence that the intelligence community presents, and then there is the rhetoric from the Iranian government. So I understand from the perspective of a non-Iranian that it's very difficult to swallow that pill, that they were not instrumental in the actual planning and the execution of it, even if they were politically in support of it. I understand that because of the rhetoric. I wouldn't expect anything else, but oftentimes with this type of conflict, and because of the nature of its controversy and sensitivity, the rhetoric will sort of trump, if you wish, the even the intelligence evidence that Giorgio was referencing. So yeah, the rhetoric is quite harsh, so it's hard to believe anything else.
I'm so glad we addressed that because, I mean, this is why we're doing this. The nuances of every situation can be sometimes twisted and give a different perspective than what is actually happening. And Georgia, I'm really glad that you pointed out that Hamas is not a proxy, but not a proxy. I'm just going to leave it there. Okay. Suzanne Fetcher asked a question, what will be the impact on Israel and perhaps Netanyahu of this U.S.-Iran agreement? And then I want to ask a follow-up question on that. Do you think that Israel will honor this agreement?
I don't think Israel will honor the agreement. And the reason that I say that is because so far, any progress being made in negotiations or agreements or treaties have been sabotaged by Israel because Israel wants to continue to protect itself and I believe has a vested interest in doing that. So my initial gut reaction is no.
And the impact, if they do follow through with this, what would the impact on Israel or perhaps Netanyahu and his government be on this agreement?
Georgia, you want to do it or you want me?
Sure. It's very clear that the Israeli leadership thinks that a diplomatic resolution to this conflict that does not entail 100% capitulation on Iran's part is a nightmarish outcome. If this agreement, and we certainly can expect this agreement to result in Iran maintaining some degree of its nuclear infrastructure, for sanctions to be relieved, some sanctions to be lifted, Tel Aviv will be concerned about the extent to which this emboldens Iran. It reintegrates the country with the global economy. It, quote unquote, legitimizes the Islamic Republic at a regional and global level. And these are huge concerns for the Israeli leadership. I think for Netanyahu, this definitely leaves him in a very bad position. His political opponents are going to point to this as a sign of his failure as an Israeli leader, the fact that this war did not end with the Islamic Republic being overthrown. They are going to hold this against him. I think I'm not an expert in Israeli domestic politics, but I have to assume that the prime minister will pay a huge political price for the so-called Islamabad MOU, as I guess we're calling it now. Going back to the first part of the question about how Israel might react, I have no doubt that Israel will try to do everything in its means to sabotage the diplomacy that Pakistan and some other regional countries are facilitating. Again, because the last thing that Tel Aviv wants to see is some sort of a diplomatic compromise between Washington and Tehran. However, Israel is very dependent on the United States. And if the Trump administration uses American leverage to tell Israel that if it does engage in conduct that sabotages the diplomacy, the U.S. will withhold the economic and military aid that the U.S. gives Israel, Israel will have no choice but to reluctantly and very bitterly go along with the deal. But in the event that the Trump administration does not impose and sustain such pressure on Israel, I have absolutely no doubt that Israel will do whatever it takes to completely derail the diplomacy. I would add one final point, though. If that pressure on Israel does come from the Trump administration and Israel does not return to waging direct military operations against Iran, I think what we're going to see is sort of a return to the quote unquote shadow war that took place between Israel and Iran for many years leading up to April 2024, when the shadow war sort of gave way to direct state to state confrontations. And just so everyone knows what I mean by shadow war, we're talking about conflict by proxy, cyber warfare, targeted assassinations, intelligence operations. I think Israel will go back to confronting Iran through those means, and it will continue to be a conflict between Israel and Iran, but it will be much more of a covert confrontation, or as the Israelis used to refer to it, the war in between the wars. That's how I see things playing out in terms of how Israel chooses to confront Iran in the event that diplomacy between the US and Iran is successful. Granted, that's a big if, though.
Very big if.
Thank you both. And we'll just do one more question, and then we'll have to end it there. But this is a couple of questions here about the current situation inside Iran, the citizens of Iran, and how we can see them moving forward. What steps can they make to create current political change with the current administration that is there. And Nooshan, this is for you. Do you have any insight on how people are feeling in the street? Is everyone looking for change? And do you think, are you hopeful that there can be some change within Iran?
Um, well, Iranians inside of Iran, the number one concern right now is the economic situation. It's, the hyperinflation, the lack of access to services. The economic situation is really degrading the Iranian morale and any hope for the future. Iranians inside Iran are similar to Iranians in diaspora. They're not a monolith. They all come from different backgrounds, depending on your religious affiliation, your socioeconomic status, your level of education, life experience, you're going to have a different view. The dissatisfaction with the regime is quite high. It is the majority of the people in Iran, but also the fear of the regime is quite high. I've had many people who are not Iranian ask me, well, why don't people just continue to protest and take onto the streets? Because they kill the protesters, because it is literally a matter of life and death for you to take on. I think that Iran will have more protests. It will implode and explode, especially young people there, especially people under 30, are under tremendous amount of pressure. And so they will take onto the streets again. But unfortunately, I do believe that this regime will collapse. I am just very concerned about how long it will take for it to collapse and the price that the Iranian people will have to pay for that to happen. So yes, they want the regime gone. How and when, I don't know. It's very difficult for them to have hope. I also am very cautious about not imposing any of my views that come from a place of privilege and luxury of not living in Iran, and assuming that no matter how much empathy I have and how much love I have for my country and my loved ones there, I don't live there. So they deal with it the best they can because they're facing a reality that is incredibly harsh, and literally fighting for their lives. So I'm for freedom, I'm for liberty. I hope it comes sooner rather than later, but I think it's going to be a very long and bloody road to that.
Thank you so much for that. That is our time. Unfortunately, our time is up. But I want to thank you both so much for joining us and providing us a really deep conversation on a very hot topic right now that's on everyone's minds. So thank you both. And to our audience, thank you so much for tuning in. And thank you for the very thoughtful questions. And I'll just end it on, guys, if you're not already a member of the World Affairs Council of Orange County, join us. We do really great things like this webinar. We're also doing an infrastructure tour series where we take our members around different infrastructure in Orange County. And we get to see kind of the inside what we do and what we do for the world. Our next one is on Thursday. It's going to be the Port of LA. So that'll be very interesting, international perspective for our infrastructure here at home. And with that, thank you guys again. We'll see you next time. All right.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank
you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.